My earliest memories aren't filled with warmth. They aren't the kind of moments children look back on with nostalgia, laughter at the dinner table, bedtime stories, or hugs after scraped knees. No, my memories are colder, sharper. They are filled with comparisons, reminders that I wasn't enough, and the echo of my mother's voice telling me over and over again that I would never measure up. From as far back as I can remember, my sister was the shining star. She was the daughter my mother adored, the one she paraded in front of neighbors and relatives like a prized possession. Every time my sister achieved something, whether it was a school drawing or a perfect grade, my mother's face lit up like the sun. She clapped, cheered, and bragged to anyone who would listen. "Isn't she wonderful? Isn't she perfect?" And then there was me, the afterthought. When I brought home good grades, my mother barely glanced at the paper. "That's what you're supposed to do," she'd say flatly, as though achievement was worthless when it came from me. If I stumbled, if I failed at something, the reaction was immediate, cruel, and sharp. "See? You'll never be like your sister. She was born to succeed. You'll never have a future." Those words became the soundtrack of my childhood. I remember one birthday in particular. I was turning 9. I had been dreaming for weeks about a toy I wanted. A simple one, nothing extravagant. But when the day came, my mother handed me a small, unwrapped box of socks. My sister, on the other hand, received a shiny new bicycle just because. She wasn't even the one celebrating. My mother explained it away with a shrug. "She deserves it. She's going places." That night, I sat on the floor of my room clutching those socks, feeling the weight of invisibility pressing down on me. I didn't cry. I just stared at the wall, wondering why I wasn't enough. The favoritism wasn't hidden. Everyone in our extended family saw it. At gatherings, my mother bragged endlessly about my sister, her beauty, her intelligence, her bright future. When it came to me, her tone shifted. "He's fine," she'd say dismissively, waving a hand as though I were an item on a grocery list. Sometimes she didn't even mention me at all. Even neighbors noticed. They'd pat my sister on the head, telling her how proud our mother must be. When they turned to me, it was usually with a pitying smile, as if they already knew the truth, that I was the unwanted one. And the worst part? My sister played along. She soaked up the praise, basked in the glory of being the chosen one. She didn't push back, didn't once say, "What about him?" Number. She thrived under the favoritism, and sometimes she even joined in the cruelty. "Mom's right," she'd whisper when no one was around. "You'll never be like me. You'll never matter." I grew up believing her, believing them both. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet ember burned. I wanted to prove them wrong. Every time my mother sneered at me, every time my sister mocked me, I swore to myself that one day I would show them that I was more than the invisible child. Still, as a boy, there was little I could do. I lived in that house under my mother's cold gaze, where every wall seemed to whisper that I didn't belong. The family home became a stage where my sister performed her role as the golden child, while I stood in the background, barely noticed, barely acknowledged. And through it all, my mother made sure I never forgot my place. She repeated it like a mantra, as though trying to carve it into my bones. "Everything I own, everything I've built, will go to your sister. The house, the money, the respect, you'll have nothing, because you are nothing." Those words lodged themselves deep inside me. They shaped who I became. But even as they crushed me, they also planted the seed of defiance. I didn't know it then, but the day would come when that seed would grow, when the balance would shift. And when it did, everything my mother believed, everything my sister took for granted, would collapse. As I grew older, the favoritism didn't fade. It sharpened. It became a daily ritual, as predictable as the rising sun. Every morning, I woke up not to the thought of who I was, but to the reminder of who I wasn't. School became the battlefield where the comparisons played out in public. My sister was the golden student. Teachers adored her, classmates gravitated toward her, and every report card she brought home was a celebration. My mother pinned her A's to the refrigerator like trophies, proudly showing them off to guests as though they were medals of honor. When I brought home my own report cards, often filled with good marks, sometimes even just as high as hers, they were barely acknowledged. My mother would glance at the page, then fold it closed without a word. "You should be grateful your sister set such a good example for you," she would say, dismissing my efforts in a single breath. No matter what I achieved, it was never enough, because my sister had already done it better. I remember the first time I actually beat her at something. It was a science fair in middle school. I had spent weeks working on my project, building a model of a solar system, painting each planet carefully, making sure every orbit was just right. My sister's project, though good, wasn't as polished. For once, the judges noticed my work. They awarded me first prize. For a brief, shining moment, I felt like maybe things could change. Maybe this was the moment my mother would finally look at me with pride. But when we got home, her reaction crushed me. "Don't let this go to your head," she said coldly. "It was just luck. Everyone knows your sister is the talented one. This doesn't change anything." Then, as if to drive the knife deeper, she turned to my sister and said, "Next year, you'll do better. You'll show him how it's really done." That was the first time I realized that in my mother's eyes, even when I won, I still lost. The comparisons weren't just academic. They seeped into every corner of our lives. If my sister sang at a school event, my mother would invite the entire extended family to watch. If I played in a game, she often didn't even show up. When my sister got her first crush, my mother gushed about how beautiful and mature she was becoming. When I did, she told me not to embarrass myself. It was humiliating, not just because of the way my mother treated me, but because she made sure the whole world saw it. Relatives, neighbors, family friends, they all knew who the favorite child was, and they treated us accordingly. At family gatherings, my sister was the star of the show. My mother made sure of it. "She's going to be a doctor," she'd brag. "She'll take over everything I leave behind. She's the future of this family." And then, when the conversation turned to me, her tone shifted. "He'll manage somehow?" she'd say with a dismissive wave. Sometimes she didn't even bother saying anything at all. The looks I got from relatives were the worst. Pity. That quiet, knowing look that said, "We know you'll never measure up." I hated it. I hated all of it. My sister, of course, relished the attention. She basked in it, thrived in it, and sometimes she twisted the knife herself. She would lean close when no one else was listening and whisper, "Mom's right. You'll never be anything. You'll never matter." At first, those words devastated me. I believed them. I carried them like stones in my chest. But over time, something inside me hardened. The more I was compared, the more invisible I became, the more a quiet defiance began to grow. I started keeping to myself, focusing on things my mother didn't notice. Books, writing, little creative projects that belonged only to me. I told myself that even if she never saw me, even if my sister kept shining, I would carve out something for myself, even if it was small. But deep down, I couldn't escape the truth. My mother's voice echoed constantly in my head, a cruel mantra. Everything will go to your sister. The house, the money, the respect. You'll be left with nothing. And the worst part was, everyone believed it. My sister walked through the world as though the crown was already hers. My mother fueled the fantasy. And I, the invisible child, was forced to live in the shadow of a future that seemed set in stone. I didn't know it then, but those years of constant comparison were shaping me in ways I couldn't yet understand. They were building a fire inside me, a fire that would burn brighter when the truth finally came to light. Because destiny, no matter how certain it seems, has a way of turning on those who take it for granted. By the time I entered my teenage years, the favoritism had stopped being something whispered behind closed doors. It was now loud, blatant, and shameless. My mother no longer bothered to hide her bias, and my sister embraced it as though it were a crown placed on her head long before the throne was empty. Family dinners became unbearable. Every conversation turned into an opportunity to exalt my sister. My mother spoke of her grades, her beauty, her future, as if she were already some kind of legend. "She's destined for greatness," my mother would say, her eyes glowing with pride. "One day, she'll run the family home, the business, everything. She'll carry on our legacy, and then her gaze would fall on me, cold and dismissive, like I was nothing more than background noise. Sometimes she wouldn't say anything at all. Other times she would smirk and add, 'And as for you, well, we'll figure something out.' Each word was a dagger, sharpened not just by my mother's cruelty, but by my sister's smug expression. She reveled in it. She sat taller at the table, smiled wider, and looked at me as if I were her servant instead of her brother. By high school, the roles were cemented. My sister was the prodigy. She was given every opportunity, every resource. Private tutoring, expensive extracurriculars, connections that my mother carefully cultivated for her future. Me, I was told not to expect much. "You're not like her," my mother said once when I asked for help applying to a summer program. "It would be a waste of money. Focus on something simple, something safe. You're not cut out for more." That was the moment I realized she wasn't just favoring my sister. She was actively trying to keep me small. The comparisons became crueler. If my sister scored a 95, my 92 was meaningless. If she was praised for her beauty, I was reminded of my flaws. "You should be grateful you have a sister like her," my mother would say. "She'll carry you when you can't carry yourself." But it wasn't just words anymore. The subject of inheritance, the thing that had once been implied, was now openly discussed. I'll never forget the night it happened. I was 17. We were sitting in the living room, and my mother had just poured herself a glass of wine. My sister sat beside her, legs crossed, twirling her hair like she was royalty waiting for her coronation. And then, out of nowhere, my mother said it. "When I'm gone, this house will be hers. The business will be hers. She'll take care of everything." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. And then, as though twisting the knife, she added, "And you, well, you'll always have a place here. Maybe your sister will let you stay in one of the guest rooms." The humiliation was unbearable. I looked at my sister, expecting maybe some sign of compassion, some flicker of kindness, but she only smirked. "Don't worry," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with venom. "I'll make sure you're comfortable." In that moment, I wanted to disappear. I wanted to run out of that house and never look back, but something else took root inside me instead. A quiet rage. I began to notice things more carefully, the way my sister flaunted her supposed future, the way my mother doted on her, and the way everyone else, our relatives, our neighbors, even our family friends, believed the story without question. To them, she was the chosen one, and I was the forgotten son. But what they didn't know, what none of them could see, was that the forgotten don't stay forgotten forever. In college, I worked harder than ever, fueled by spite as much as ambition. I chose fields my sister wouldn't touch, carved out spaces that were mine alone. And though my mother still dismissed me, I knew I was building something no one could take away. Still, every phone call, every holiday visit, carried the same poison. My sister bragging about how she'd inherit everything soon enough. My mother repeating her mantra, "You'll never have to worry. She'll take care of you. Take care of me." The words made me sick. I wasn't a child anymore. I didn't need anyone to take care of me. But they said it so often, with such certainty, that it felt like the future had already been written in ink. The irony, though, and the thing none of them knew, was that while my sister paraded around as though she had already won, my mother had made a mistake. A mistake that would change everything. A mistake hidden in legal documents, locked away in a lawyer's office, waiting for the day it would be revealed. And when that day finally came, the look on my sister's face would be worth every cruel word, every comparison, every humiliation. Because the crown she thought was hers had never truly belonged to her at all. By the time I reached my teenage years, the gap between my sister and me had turned into a canyon, wide, deep, and impossible to cross. What had once been subtle favoritism had now become a daily performance, a spectacle for anyone who happened to be watching. My mother no longer hid her bias. She flaunted it, almost proudly, as if to remind me and the world around us that there was only one child worth celebrating, and it wasn't me. At school, my sister continued to shine. She wasn't just good at her studies, she was the golden student. Teachers adored her, administrators recommended her for leadership programs, and classmates hung on to her every word as though she were destined for greatness. I wasn't failing, not at all. I earned good grades, sometimes even higher than hers. But it didn't matter. In my mother's eyes, my achievements were invisible. I remember one particular evening vividly. I had worked tirelessly on a history paper, staying up until 2 a.m. to perfect every detail. When the graded essay came back, I had earned a 98, higher than my sister's 94 on her own assignment. For once, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would earn me even the smallest acknowledgement. When I showed my mother, she barely looked up from her phone. "That's good," she said flatly, and then, almost as if to erase my moment, she turned to my sister and cooed, "But you know what? Even when you don't get the highest grade, you're still the most impressive. You have that natural gift your brother just doesn't have." That night, I realized something devastating. No matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, I could never outshine the pedestal on which my mother had placed her. The favoritism wasn't just academic. It was woven into every corner of our lives. At birthdays, my sister's gifts were extravagant: jewelry, designer clothes, expensive gadgets. Mine, practical, uninspired things: a set of notebooks, a plain pair of shoes. The message was clear: she was worth investing in, I was not. When relatives visited, my mother paraded my sister around like a trophy. "She's going to be a doctor one day," she bragged. "She'll inherit the business and the house. She's the one who will carry our family into the future." Then, inevitably, her gaze would land on me, and her tone would shift. "And him? Well, he'll manage. He's not cut from the same cloth." It was humiliating, not only because of how she treated me, but because everyone else believed her. Family friends, aunts, uncles, even neighbors. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and dismissal. Their eyes said what their lips didn't. "You're the spare, the extra, the one who doesn't count." But the cruelty didn't stop there. For the first time, my mother began to speak openly about inheritance. What had once been implied in whispers now became part of everyday conversation. One night, when I was 17, I came downstairs to find my mother and sister in the living room. My mother was sipping wine, her words loose and unguarded. My sister sat beside her, smirking as though she were already royalty. "When I'm gone," my mother said with absolute certainty, "this house will be hers. The business, the money, everything. She's the one who will carry on my legacy." Her words hit me like a slap, and then, as if to twist the knife, she added, "And you? Well, maybe she'll let you stay in one of the guest rooms." I froze. My sister turned toward me, her smirk curling into a cruel smile. "Don't worry," she whispered, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "I'll make sure you're comfortable." That was the night something inside me cracked. Until then, I had clung to the hope that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself enough, my mother might eventually see me. But her words stripped away that illusion. In her mind, my future wasn't mine to shape. It belonged to my sister. And yet, something else ignited inside me that night. A quiet defiance, a fire I hadn't known I carried. If the throne was promised to her before it was even empty, then I would stop waiting for permission. I would build my own kingdom. One they couldn't control, one they couldn't dismiss. College became my escape, my refuge. Away from home, I finally had space to breathe. I chose a different path entirely, one that my sister would never dare to tread. I threw myself into my studies, not to please my mother, but to prove to myself that I was capable of more than she had ever imagined. Still, the phone calls, the holiday visits, the rare times I returned home, they were poisoned. My sister bragged about her future as though it were already signed, sealed, and delivered. My mother reinforced it with every word, repeating her mantra, "She will inherit everything. You'll never have to worry because she'll take care of you. Take care of me." Those words were the cruelest of all. They reduced me from a son to a burden, from a human being to an afterthought. But here's what no one in my family knew. Not my mother, not my sister, not the relatives who smirked when they looked at me. While they were crowning her in advance, while they were dismissing me as the shadow behind her light, something else was happening. Something they could never have predicted. A mistake had been made. A mistake buried in legal documents. A mistake that would not reveal itself until years later. And when the day finally came, when the lawyer opened those papers and spoke the words that none of them expected, the throne they had promised her would crumble to dust, and for the first time in my life, I would no longer be invisible. Adulthood didn't free me from the shadow of favoritism. If anything, it made it heavier. Because now the stakes weren't about grades or school competitions. Now the stakes were legacy, the house, the business, the family name. And in my mother's eyes, that legacy had already been assigned. When I returned home from college for holidays or birthdays, the difference between how my mother treated my sister and how she treated me became unbearable. My sister was no longer just the golden child. She was now the heir apparent, paraded around like the next ruler of an empire. I remember walking into the living room one Christmas and seeing my mother handing my sister a set of keys. Not just any keys, the spare set to the family business office. She placed them in my sister's palm with the kind of ceremony most people reserve for a crown or a coronation. "One day, all of this will be yours," she said proudly, her voice thick with pride. "You'll know what to do when the time comes." My sister looked at me across the room, the keys dangling from her fingers like a taunt. "Don't worry," she said sweetly, just loud enough for me to hear. "I'll find something for you, too." Maybe a desk job, something simple. I laughed bitterly, but inside, the humiliation burned. Every gesture, every word, made it clear that I wasn't a son in my mother's eyes anymore. I was an afterthought, a dependent, a footnote to my sister's shining story. The family gatherings only reinforced it. Relatives who once offered me pity now spoke openly about the future. "Your sister will do great things with the company," they would say. "She'll keep the family strong. And you, well, maybe you'll find your own path somewhere else." It was suffocating. It was as though everyone around me had signed some secret contract that declared her the victor long before the race had even finished. My sister basked in it. She wore her role like a crown, reminding me at every turn that she was destined to inherit everything. She dropped hints constantly, little barbs dressed as jokes. "When this is all mine," she'd say, sweeping her hand across the room, "maybe I'll let you redecorate your old bedroom. You can make it into a hobby space or something." Each time she said it, my mother would chuckle softly, never once correcting her, never once saying, "It's not decided yet." Because to her, it was decided. It had been decided years ago. I tried to pull away. I tried to live my own life, build my own career, find meaning outside of their suffocating expectations. And in many ways, I succeeded. I supported myself. I carved out a life that was mine. But every time I came back home, every time I heard my sister and mother talking in hushed tones about the future, that old knot in my stomach tightened. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was destiny. Or so they thought. I'll never forget the night it became undeniable. It was my mother's birthday. The house was filled with relatives, laughter, and the smell of roasted chicken, just like it had been every year since childhood. After dinner, my mother stood, glass of wine in hand, and made a toast. "To my daughter," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "The future of our family, the one who will carry on everything I've worked for." I couldn't be more proud. There was applause. Cheers. My sister glowed. soaking in the attention like a queen acknowledged by her court. And me? I sat there, my glass untouched, my heart pounding. Not once did my mother even mention my name. Not once did she acknowledge that she had another child sitting right there at the same table. The humiliation wasn't just private anymore, it was public. It was carved into stone with every word, every toast, every declaration. That night, as I lay in my old childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. My mother had already buried me in her mind. I was alive, yes, but invisible, forgotten, unworthy of being part of her grand vision. And yet, there was something she didn't know, something none of them knew, because while my mother and sister were so sure of the future, while they were already dividing the spoils of an inheritance not yet passed, there was a document, a single piece of paper signed and sealed years earlier, that told a different story. A story that would not only shatter my sister's illusions, but also unravel the image of control my mother had built so carefully. That document was waiting, locked away in an office drawer, held by a man they never bothered to consider, the lawyer. And when the time came, when those words were read aloud, the future they thought was set in stone would crack and crumble into dust. The phone call came on a rainy Thursday evening. I remember the sound of the rain tapping against my apartment window, the steady rhythm of it, when my phone lit up with my sister's name. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken in weeks, and our conversations were usually sharp, filled with little digs and passive-aggressive remarks. But something told me I needed to pick up. Her voice was different this time, lower, heavier. "She's gone," she said, just like that. No build-up, no details, just 2 words that hung in the air like smoke. Our mother was dead. I sat in silence, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I should have felt grief, and I did. Somewhere deep in me, a part of me mourned. But there was something else, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. Relief. Relief that the woman who had spent my entire life reminding me of my worthlessness could no longer hold that power over me. The funeral was set for the following week. When I arrived at the family home, the atmosphere was thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of her absence. Relatives bustled about in black clothing, offering rehearsed condolences and whispering behind cupped hands. I could feel their eyes on me, their pity disguised as sympathy. "Your sister will take good care of everything now," one aunt whispered as she squeezed my arm. "Don't worry, you'll be looked after." There it was again. That poisonous phrase, looked after, as though I were some helpless child incapable of surviving without my sister's mercy. My sister, of course, was radiant even in mourning. She wore her grief like a designer dress, tailored perfectly to fit the occasion. She hugged relatives, accepted condolences, and moved through the crowd with an ease that screamed control. This was her stage, her performance, and she knew it. She cornered me at one point, her eyes red from carefully timed tears. "This is what she wanted," she said softly, though her voice carried a sharpness only I could hear. "For me to take care of everything. And don't worry, I'll make sure you have something. Something." As if my entire life could be reduced to a scrap tossed from her overflowing plate. During the service, I couldn't help but feel like an outsider. The eulogies were filled with praise for my mother. Words about her strength, her vision, her devotion to the family. And while those things might have been true to others, to me, they were a reminder of the woman who had shaped my life through rejection. I sat there, hands clenched, thinking of all the times she had dismissed me, belittled me, erased me. But the whispers around me weren't about grief. They were about the will. "When do you think the lawyer will read it?" a cousin muttered to another. "I'm sure it's already clear who gets what," the other replied, glancing toward my sister. She was always the favorite. It'll all go to her. The certainty in their voices made my stomach twist. They were so sure, so confident, just like my mother had been. To them, it was already decided. After the burial, everyone gathered at the house. The mood was strange, almost split. Some wept quietly, others whispered about business, property, and money. My sister played the role of hostess, moving from group to group with practiced ease. She looked like a queen ascending her throne, receiving her court. I stayed in the background watching, listening. My grief was real, but it was tangled in anger and exhaustion, and beneath it all was something else. Anticipation. Because I knew what none of them did. I knew that there was one piece of the puzzle they hadn't seen, one card my mother had never played. The lawyer. He was set to arrive the following day to read the will. And while my sister moved through the house like the coronation had already taken place, I couldn't stop thinking about the sealed envelope, the papers inside, the truth hidden in legal ink. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the house as if it were whispering to me. I thought about all the years of humiliation, all the times I had been told I would have nothing, that everything would belong to her. And I thought about how tomorrow, in front of everyone, those words might finally be challenged, because sometimes destiny isn't what people think it is. Sometimes the crown slips before it can be placed. And sometimes the throne belongs to someone no one ever expected. The morning of the will reading arrived with a heaviness that pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. The house, usually filled with chatter and clinking dishes, was eerily quiet. Even the air seemed still, waiting. I woke early, unable to stay in bed any longer, and wandered the halls of the home I had grown up in, the place that had been both sanctuary and prison. Every picture frame on the walls told a story. Birthdays where my sister's cake towered over mine, family portraits where I was pushed to the side, snapshots of holidays where my smile was forced, my eyes dulled. This house wasn't just brick and wood. It was a museum of favoritism, curated by my mother's unwavering devotion to one child. And now, that museum was about to be divided. By mid-morning, the relatives began to arrive, dressed once again in black, though this time their somber attire didn't carry the weight of grief. No, today it was different. Today, their eyes sparkled with curiosity and calculation. Today wasn't about mourning. It was about inheritance. I watched them gather in the living room, their hushed voices carrying just enough for me to catch fragments. Of course it'll all go to her. She always said her daughter would take over. He's lucky if he gets a token, maybe a small savings bond. Every word was a knife, not because I hadn't heard it before, but because I knew how certain they were. My entire family had built a narrative around my invisibility, and they believed it with religious devotion. My sister entered the room last, as if she had been waiting for the perfect moment to make an entrance. She wore a dark dress, elegant and commanding, her hair styled flawlessly. She carried herself not like a grieving daughter, but like a queen arriving to claim her throne. Heads turned as she entered. Some relatives smiled, others nodded approvingly. The unspoken message was clear. Here comes the heir. She caught my eye across the room, and her lips curled into a faint smile, not of comfort, not of solidarity, but of victory. Then, the sound of the front door opening. All conversations ceased instantly. Every head turned. The lawyer stepped inside. He was a tall man in his late 50s, his suit pressed, his briefcase clutched firmly in his hand. His presence carried authority. He had no ties to our family other than this task, and that neutrality made him dangerous. He wasn't here to play into my sister's performance. He wasn't here to preserve illusions. He was here for one purpose, to read the truth written on paper. "Thank you all for being here," he said, his voice steady, professional. "As you know, your mother entrusted me with her final wishes. Today, we will go through the terms of her last will and testament." The relatives shuffled closer, their eyes gleaming. My sister sat front and center, her posture straight, her chin lifted, every muscle in her body radiating confidence. I stayed toward the back, half in shadow, my arms crossed, my heart pounding. The lawyer opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick envelope, and carefully broke the seal. The sound of tearing paper echoed louder than it should have in the silence of that room. Then he unfolded the documents and began to read. At the time of my passing, I, Margaret Harris, being of sound mind and body, leave behind the following directives regarding the distribution of my estate. The words were formal, clinical. He started with small items first: family heirlooms, jewelry, personal possessions. As expected, most of it was directed to my sister. A necklace here, a ring there, things my mother had always promised her. My sister's smile grew with each mention, her smug glances darting toward me as if to say, "See, just as we always knew." Then came the larger items. To my daughter, Emily, I leave the summer cottage on Lake Ashton, along with its furnishings and the boat currently stored in the garage. Applause murmured through the room. Relatives nodded approvingly. My sister tilted her head in a small bow, as though accepting her crown. And to my son, Daniel. The room stilled. Every eye turned toward me. For a moment, even my sister's smile faltered. I leave the Harris family home, with full ownership rights, including all properties attached to it. The words hit the air like a thunderclap. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the shock ripple through the room. My sister's jaw tightened, her hands clenching in her lap. The lawyer didn't pause. He continued reading, his voice unwavering. Furthermore, to my son Daniel, I entrust controlling interest in Harris Construction, with the stipulation that he may continue or dissolve the company at his discretion. My daughter Emily will receive dividends only as long as the company remains active. Gasps filled the air. A cousin actually dropped his glass. My sister's face drained of color, her smug composure cracking like porcelain struck by a hammer. I sat frozen, barely breathing. For so long I had been told I was nothing. For so long I had been told that everything would go to her. And now, in one moment, that narrative was shattered. The lawyer pressed on, detailing minor clauses and conditions, but no one was listening anymore. The only thing that mattered had already been spoken. When he finally folded the papers and placed them back in the envelope, the silence in the room was unbearable. Then, slowly, whispers erupted. "This changes everything." Did she know? Why would she do that? My sister stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood. Her face was red now, twisted with rage, barely held in check. This can't be right," she snapped. She told me everything would be mine. She promised." The lawyer looked at her calmly, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Harris was very clear in her instructions. "These documents are legally binding." She turned toward me then, her eyes burning with fury. For the first time in our lives, she looked small, shaken, afraid. And for the first time, I didn't look away. I had spent years being invisible, years being dismissed, years being told that my sister would inherit the world while I was left with scraps. But now, in this moment, I held the thing she had always claimed as hers: the house, the business, the legacy. And though I hadn't asked for it, though I hadn't chased it, fate had delivered it to me in the most dramatic way possible. But as I sat there, absorbing the shock that rippled through the room, I realized something. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning, because crowns don't fall without a fight. And my sister? She wasn't the kind of person to surrender quietly. The lawyer's words still hung in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to die. The room was tense, thick with disbelief. I could feel every pair of eyes darting between me and my sister, waiting for someone to break the silence. It was my sister who snapped first. She rose so abruptly that her chair slammed backward into the wall. Her face was flushed, her chest rising and falling rapidly as though she had just run a marathon. "No!" she spat, her voice sharp and venomous. "This is a mistake. It has to be. My mother promised me everything. She told me it was all mine. This is wrong." The lawyer remained calm, folding his hands neatly in front of him. "I assure you, Miss Harris, these documents are valid. They were signed in the presence of witnesses, notarized and updated only 6 months ago. There is no mistake." Her eyes widened, her fury giving way to shock. 6 months ago? She changed it 6 months ago? She looked around the room as if searching for allies, her gaze landing on each relative in turn. "She never told me." She never said a word. This isn't fair. It's not fair. Life isn't fair, Emily, I said quietly from the back of the room. My voice was steady, though inside my heart was racing. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing like daggers. You! She hissed. This is your fault. You poisoned her against me. You manipulated her somehow. She would never have done this unless you pushed her. I shook my head slowly. I didn't push her. I didn't even know. For once, she made a choice without telling either of us. Maybe you should ask yourself why she made it. Gasps rippled through the room. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably, clearly uneasy with the confrontation unfolding before them. An uncle cleared his throat. Now, Emily, maybe your mother saw something in Daniel that you didn't. Don't you dare, she snapped, cutting him off. Don't you dare stand there and defend him. He's done nothing his whole life. Nothing. I was the one who worked with her, who learned the business, who carried her legacy, and he— She jabbed a finger toward me. He ran off, hid in his own little world, and now what? He gets rewarded? He gets everything? I felt the sting of her words, but I refused to let it show. I didn't ask for this, I said calmly. But maybe she finally saw the truth. Maybe she realized that the way she raised us, the favoritism, the cruelty, it was wrong. Maybe this was her way of trying to make it right. My sister's face twisted, a storm of rage and disbelief. Make it right? By betraying me? By humiliating me in front of everyone? She didn't humiliate you, I said. She chose what she thought was best. And deep down, you know it. Her lips trembled, but instead of crumbling, she hardened. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. This isn't over, she declared. I'll contest it. I'll take this to court if I have to. Do you hear me, Daniel? I'll fight you with everything I have. That house, that company, that legacy, it's mine. It's always been mine. And no piece of paper is going to change that. The room erupted in murmurs. Some relatives nodded in support of her, whispering about how unfair it all seemed. Others looked uneasy, glancing at me with new eyes, as if seeing me for the first time. The family was dividing right there in front of me. One aunt spoke softly, almost to herself, but loud enough for all to hear. Maybe Margaret realized Emily was too much like her. Too cold, too ruthless. Maybe she wanted something different for the family Emily spun toward her, fury burning in her eyes. How dare you, she shouted. You don't know what she wanted. None of you do. She told me everything was mine, but the conviction in her voice was already cracking. I stood slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. You spent your whole life believing you were entitled to everything. You wore it like a crown before it was ever yours. But entitlement isn't the same as destiny, Emily. And maybe Mom finally realized that her hands shook at her sides. For a moment I thought she might lunge at me, but instead she turned sharply on her heel, her dress sweeping behind her as she stormed out of the room. The front door slammed with a force that rattled the windows. Silence followed her exit, heavy and suffocating. The lawyer cleared his throat again, adjusting his glasses. As I said, the will is legally binding. Of course, Miss Harris has the right to contest it in court. But unless she can prove undue influence, which would be difficult, the terms stand. I nodded, though my mind was spinning. This was far from over. My sister wouldn't go quietly. She had spent her entire life believing the world was hers, and now, for the first time, that illusion had been ripped away. And if I knew her at all, she would come back swinging. But for now, for this brief, fleeting moment, I felt something I had never felt before in this house. Power. Not power over others. Power over myself. For once, I wasn't invisible. For once, I mattered. Still, I knew the battle had only begun. Because a crown denied is more dangerous than a crown given. And Emily was not the kind of person who could bear being denied. The days following the will reading were like walking through a battlefield after the first shots had been fired. The air was quiet, but the tension was thick, vibrating beneath the surface. My sister had stormed out in fury, but her absence didn't mean surrender. No, her silence was strategy. I knew her well enough to understand that she wouldn't lick her wounds in private. She was planning, plotting, and it didn't take long for me to see the results. Relatives who had been polite to me after the will reading suddenly became distant. Phone calls went unanswered, invitations to family dinners that my sister now hosted in our mother's old dining room, never reached me. When I called one aunt to ask how she was holding up, she stammered an excuse before hanging up quickly, as if afraid of being caught speaking to me. It was clear my sister was working the family. Whispers reached me through the grapevine. She was telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated our mother in her final months, that I had preyed on her vulnerability, convincing her to change the will out of spite. She painted herself as the betrayed daughter, robbed of her rightful inheritance by a scheming brother who had always been jealous. She cared for her mother every day, one cousin told me over coffee, his voice hesitant. That's what Emily says. She was there, running the business, supporting her. And you left. You built your own life. Why would your mother suddenly give it all to you? I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he hadn't been there in the quiet moments when my mother looked at me with something different in her eyes, something like regret. I wanted to explain that maybe, just maybe, she realized the legacy she built didn't need another version of herself to carry it forward. It needed someone different, someone softer, someone who had been shaped not by favoritism, but by fire. But I didn't, because I knew the truth wouldn't matter to those who had already chosen sides. Meanwhile, my sister grew bolder. She called me one evening, her voice laced with venom hidden behind a veneer of civility. "Daniel," she said, "this is your chance to make things right. Sign over the business to me. Keep the house if you want. I don't care. But the company? That's mine. Everyone knows it." I laughed bitterly. "Everyone thought it was yours." But Mom made her choice. Her voice dropped, sharp and icy. "If you think this is over, you're a fool. I have people on my side, people who matter. And when I'm finished, you'll be nothing more than a thief clinging to what doesn't belong to you." She hung up before I could respond. Her words echoed in my mind long after the line went dead. She was dangerous now. Not because of what she had, but because of what she had lost. A crown denied can turn into a weapon sharper than any blade. And I could already feel the first cuts. Relatives withdrawing, friends questioning, doubt creeping in like poison. But I wasn't the same boy she had bullied growing up. I wasn't invisible anymore. I had something real, something tangible, something she couldn't erase with whispers. The house, the business, the will. Still, I knew this was only the beginning. My sister wasn't just fighting for money or property. She was fighting for the identity she had worn her entire life. She wasn't just losing an inheritance. She was losing herself. And a person who feels like they're losing themselves will burn everything to the ground before letting go. It began with a letter, thick, official, printed on paper that carried the weight of a battlefield declaration. When I tore it open, my hands already trembling, the words confirmed what I had known deep down since the will reading. My sister wasn't going to let this go quietly. She had filed a legal petition to contest the will. The accusations cut like knives, each sentence dripping with venom disguised as formality. Undue influence, manipulation of the deceased, exploitation of emotional vulnerability. According to her, I was a predator who had wormed his way into our mother's final decisions, twisting her judgment to steal what was rightfully hers. Reading those words, I felt sick. They weren't just legal claims. They were an attack on my character, my very identity. She wasn't just trying to take the house or the business. She was trying to erase me, to rewrite the story so that I was the villain and she was the victim. And she didn't stop at the courts. Soon, the whispers in the family turned into open accusations. A cousin pulled me aside at a gathering and said, "Daniel, I don't know what you did, but Emily says your mother wasn't thinking clearly at the end, that she was on medication, confused. Maybe she didn't even know what she was signing." The words stung because they weren't entirely untrue. My mother had been sick in her final months. She had been on medication. But I knew. that she was lucid when she signed that will. I remembered the steady way she spoke the last time we were alone together, the way her eyes locked on mine with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. That wasn't confusion, that was intention. But my sister didn't care about the truth. She cared about perception, and she was winning. Relatives began choosing sides. Some sent me messages of support, whispering that maybe Margaret had finally realized her mistakes, but most aligned themselves with Emily. She was persuasive, confident, relentless. She reminded them of all the years she had sacrificed for the family business, how she had stood by our mother, while I had abandoned her to pursue my own life. It didn't matter that her sacrifices were never sacrifices at all, but rewards. It didn't matter that I had been pushed away, dismissed, cast aside. All that mattered was the story she told, and she told it well. The legal battle dragged on. Court dates loomed. My lawyer, a pragmatic man with tired eyes, warned me that contests like this could take years. "She'll dig up everything she can," he said. "Old arguments, bad decisions, anything to make you look unstable. Be ready for your past to be put on display," and she did exactly that. Soon, the accusations went beyond my mother's will. Emily painted me as irresponsible, claiming I had debts I couldn't manage, relationships I had ruined, jobs I had quit. She even dredged up my teenage mistakes, nights I had snuck out, times I had failed classes, moments of weakness twisted into proof of a lifelong pattern. I sat in the courtroom, listening as her lawyer described me like I was a parasite. Every word made me want to stand up and shout the truth, but my lawyer squeezed my arm, reminding me to stay silent. "Patience," he whispered. "The truth will have its turn." But patience was hard when the entire room seemed to lean in her direction. What struck me most was how much she enjoyed it. Sitting across from me, her lips curled in the faintest smile as her lawyer tore me apart. It wasn't just about winning, it was about watching me break. And yet, there were cracks. I noticed them when she spoke directly, when she was forced to answer questions about her own behavior. Her eyes darted nervously when asked about her relationship with our mother in the final months. Her voice shook when pressed about financial records from the company. She recovered quickly, of course. She was good at that. But for the first time, I saw something beneath her armor. Fear. Because deep down, she knew the truth. She knew our mother's decision hadn't been a mistake or confusion or manipulation. It had been deliberate. It had been justice. But the truth didn't stop her from fighting with everything she had. She called in witnesses, family friends, old business associates, who swore she had always been the responsible one, the devoted child. She filled the courtroom with her narrative, and I had to sit there, silent, while she painted me as a fraud. And outside the courtroom, she played her role just as fiercely. She hosted family dinners, invited relatives over, showed them spreadsheets of the business, acting as though she still ran it, as though nothing had changed. She was desperate to keep her crown in place, even if it was already slipping. The strain began to wear on me. Nights were sleepless, filled with worry. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every accusation, every whisper, every look of doubt in my relatives' eyes. I told myself I didn't care what they thought, but the truth was, I did. I had spent my entire life wanting to be seen, to be acknowledged. And now, when I finally had the chance, my sister was doing everything she could to erase me again. But there was one thing she hadn't counted on. The will wasn't just a document, it was a message. A deliberate choice by a woman who had spent her life favoring one child and, in her final act, had chosen the other. That wasn't something Emily could erase with accusations. That wasn't something she could rewrite, no matter how many relatives she turned, no matter how many lies she told, because the truth has a way of resurfacing, and soon, very soon, the cracks in her story would widen until the entire facade collapsed. The courtroom was colder than usual that day, though maybe it was just me. Weeks had passed since my sister filed the contest, weeks of accusations, endless back and forth, and sleepless nights filled with doubt. I had grown used to walking into the building with a knot in my stomach, bracing myself for whatever new story she and her lawyer had crafted to tear me down. but today was different. Today, the lawyer representing my mother's estate had something new to present. The judge called the session to order, his voice steady, almost bored, as though he had seen 1,000 cases just like ours. My sister sat across from me, her chin lifted high, her confidence radiating despite the cracks I had begun to notice. She still believed she could win. She still believed the crown was hers. My lawyer stood and approached the bench. "Your Honor," he began, "we have additional evidence to submit, evidence that directly addresses the validity of the will and the intent of the deceased, Mrs. Margaret Harris." My sister shifted uncomfortably. For the first time in weeks, her composure faltered. The lawyer held up a thick folder. "This is a collection of letters, emails, and personal notes written by Mrs. Harris in the months leading up to the signing of the will. These documents were provided to me directly by her attorney of record, who has since confirmed their authenticity. They not only prove she was of sound mind, but they also reveal her reasoning for altering the terms of her estate." He opened the folder and began to read aloud. The words that filled the room cut through the air sharper than any accusation Emily had thrown at me. "I have spent my life favoring one child over the other. I believed it was strength, discipline, and ambition I was rewarding, but I see now that I was blind. In raising one child to believe she was entitled to everything, I created arrogance. And in dismissing the other, I forced him into resilience. It is Daniel, not Emily, who understands sacrifice, humility, and perseverance. He has built his own path without my help, without my praise. It is he who can carry the weight of this family's legacy with wisdom rather than entitlement. For this reason, I have chosen to leave him the house and the company. This is not punishment for Emily, but justice for Daniel." The courtroom fell silent. Every word echoed in my chest, heavy and liberating at the same time. My mother had seen me, truly seen me. Maybe too late, maybe after years of neglect, but in the end, she had understood. I looked at my sister. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. For years she had worn her entitlement like armor, but now it cracked, piece by piece, until she looked almost small, vulnerable. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. She couldn't, she told me. But the evidence was undeniable. The letters were in my mother's handwriting, her words signed, dated, verified. The judge glanced over them and then looked back at Emily. "It seems clear, Miss Harris, that your mother's intent was deliberate." "Unless you have compelling evidence to the contrary, this case is settled," Emily's lawyer stammered, flipping through papers. But there was nothing left to argue. The foundation of her claim had crumbled. When the judge declared the will valid and binding, a wave of relief washed over me so strong I nearly collapsed. My sister, meanwhile, sat frozen, her jaw clenched, her hands gripping the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. It was over. As we left the courtroom, she brushed past me, her eyes burning with rage and humiliation. "This isn't the end," she hissed. "You think you've won, but you'll see." "I'll never forgive you. Never," I didn't respond. For once, I didn't need to. Because it wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about being seen. About finally stepping out of the shadow I had lived in all my life. That night, back in the house I now owned, I walked through the rooms slowly, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time, it didn't feel like a museum of favoritism. It felt like something else, a new beginning. I paused in the study, where my mother's handwriting still lingered on documents and notes. My fingers traced the edges of one of her letters, the words that had finally set me free. Her voice echoed in my mind. "This is not punishment for Emily, but justice for Daniel." And for the first time in my life, I believed her. The crown my sister had always believed was hers had never truly belonged to her. It had always been waiting, quietly, patiently, for the one person no one ever expected,